Marigold and the Moonlight Mail. Summary. Marigold, a hedgehog with a tiny mailbag, delivers letters between forest animals at night by moonlight. One evening, a mysterious letter with no name arrives, and she's determined to find its true owner. Her journey reveals how words, even unspoken ones, can bring comfort to lonely hearts. Crescent Moon Segment 1. The Quietest Hedgehog. In the quiet heart of the whispering woods, where the trees leaned in like old friends sharing secrets, there lived a hedgehog named Marigold. She was not the biggest creature in the forest, nor the fastest. In fact, Marigold was quite small, barely the size of a teacup, with cinnamon brown fur that caught the moonlight like velvet. Her back was covered in delicate spines that shimmered silver at night, and her eyes were the warm color of amber tea. Thoughtful and calm, she rarely spoke more than she needed, but when she did, her voice was soft and kind, like the rustling of dry leaves. Marigold lived in a cozy hollow beneath the roots of an old birch tree, its white bark peeling like curled parchment. Inside, her home was neat and quiet, filled with small acorns, folded leaf notes, and bundles of lavender to keep the air sweet. On the wall hung a hand-woven pouch, a mailbag made from pine needle cloth and stitched with spider silk. This was no ordinary bag. It carried the dreams and messages of the forest, delivered beneath the stars. Because Marigold was no ordinary hedgehog. She was the moonlight mail carrier, known only to the nighttime creatures, the ones who stirred when the world above was fast asleep. And every night, as the stars blinked awake and the moon climbed high, Marigold would step out into the cool hush of the woods, ready to begin her quiet, magical work. Crescent Moon Segment 2. A World That Woke at Night. As Marigold stepped out from the shelter of her hollow, the forest exhaled in hush and silver. The world around her was no longer asleep. It had simply shifted into something softer, slower, and dreamlike. Above her, the sky was a dark velvet blue, scattered with stars that pulsed gently, like tiny firefly hearts. The moon hung low and round, its light spilling between the leaves in cool beams that made the moss glow faintly underfoot. Marigold loved that light. It made everything feel brushed in kindness. The trees in the whispering woods stood tall and still, their trunks wrapped in moss and their roots tangled like gentle arms embracing the earth. Fireflies blinked lazily among the ferns, and from somewhere high in the branches, a nightbird sang a song that sounded like the hush of a lullaby. Marigold walked slowly, her paws silent on the damp path. Her mailbag swayed gently at her side, filled with tiny letters folded from birch bark, pressed flower petals, and soft parchment made from spider webs and leaf pulp. Each one held a message, a poem, a thank you, a question, a dream. Some were silly, some were secret, all were special. This forest had no clocks. No one rushed. No one shouted. Everything moved like it was floating in warm water. And in this dream-wrapped world, Marigold walked with quiet purpose. Tonight, the forest would whisper, and she would listen. Because in the dark, quiet hours, even the smallest message could mean everything. Crescent Moon Segment 3. The Letter Route. Marigold followed a path she knew by heart, though it twisted and turned like a ribbon caught in a breeze. It was a trail not marked on any map, only remembered by paws, wings, and whispers. She reached into her mailbag with a careful paw, feeling the texture of each letter. Some were smooth and pressed flat, others gently crinkled like they held laughter inside. She sorted them by memory, recalling who had written and who was waiting to receive. The first letter was a note from a squirrel named Tivy to his grandmother across the valley. He had written it in acorn ink, folded it into a square the size of a raindrop, and sealed it with a hazelnut cap. Marigold tucked it into the front pocket of her satchel, ready for delivery. Further down the path, she would deliver a poem from a sleepy mole to a cricket who played lullabies on a blade of grass. Another letter held a drawing from a young rabbit to her favorite teacher, a tiny owl who taught forest creatures to count stars. Marigold didn't just carry messages. She carried feelings: excitement, hope, curiosity, and sometimes the kind of soft sadness that came with missing someone far away. Each letter was more than paper and ink. It was a thread, a connection, a little spark of thought traveling through the dark. And Marigold, with her steady steps and quiet eyes, was the one who made sure those sparks always found their way home. Crescent Moon Segment 4. The first stop, Wren's Nest. Marigold's paws led her beneath the oldest oak in the clearing, its bark deep-lined like a kindly face, its limbs thick with ivy and moonshadow. High above, tucked between two branches where the leaves cradled the night, was the Wren family's nest. She stood quietly beneath it and gave a soft click-click sound with her tongue, 3 tiny taps that meant, "Mail has arrived." From the nest came a rustle, then a tiny brown head peeked out. Wrenling, the youngest of the brood. His feathers were fluffed with sleep. "Oh, is it from Cousin Tella?" he chirped, fluttering down to a lower branch. Marigold nodded and reached into her bag, gently pulling out a leaf folded into a perfect heart shape. It smelled faintly of honeysuckle and cinnamon bark. Wrenling clutched it in his claws and beamed. "She always writes songs in her letters," he said dreamily. I read them out loud, and the nest gets quieter. Marigold gave a soft smile. She liked hearing that. Letters didn't just travel across distance. They settled into nests, into hearts, and sometimes into dreams. A sleepy whistle sounded from above as the other wrens stirred gently. Wrenling bowed his head politely. "Thank you, Miss Marigold," he whispered, nestling the letter into the twigs. Marigold nodded once, quietly, then turned from the old oak. The letter had found its place, and the forest, soft with feathers and shadows, was still waiting. She padded on, the cool hush of the woods wrapping around her like a song. Crescent Moon Segment 5, the Glowberry Grove. Beyond the great oak, Marigold followed the winding path toward Glowberry Grove, a hollow where the bushes grew low and round, their branches heavy with glowing berries that pulsed gently like candlelight. The air here shimmered faintly, touched by the scent of wild mint and damp moss. The grove was always her favorite place to pass through. Here, the world seemed to hum with an old magic, quiet, ancient, and kind. Moths flitted between the berries, their wings dusted in silver, trailing sleepy light in the air behind them. A slow breeze stirred the leaves, which made a sound like pages turning in a storybook. Marigold stopped for a moment, letting her breath settle with the rhythm of the grove. Her little nose twitched. She could feel the forest stillness here, not empty, but full of dreaming roots, listening stones, and resting wings. It was the kind of silence that welcomed you in and made you feel you belonged. She reached into her bag again, pulling out a letter tied with a silken strand. This one was meant for a snail who lived under the glowberry's roots. A thank you note from a beetle who'd borrowed a polished pebble for his home. Marigold placed the letter by a smooth, flat stone beside the roots, then brushed a paw across it like a blessing. The berries above her flickered warmly. The moths danced on. And Marigold, quiet and steady, stepped back onto the path, her lantern heart glowing gently from within. Crescent Moon Segment 6, the River Stone. The path grew cooler as Marigold padded toward the river, its slow, silvery voice humming softly through the sleeping forest. Moonlight stretched long across its surface, glimmering like threads stitched into water. Crickets sang along the banks, their rhythm steady, like a lullaby with no end. She reached the river stone, a smooth, wide rock that jutted out into the shallows like a flat boat. Beneath it, nestled in the pebbles and reeds, lived the old turtle pair, Pebble and Moss, who never left the water and never missed a letter. Marigold stepped onto the stone and gently tapped its edge with a curled paw. Tap, tap, tap. A few moments passed, then two round heads emerged from the water, wrinkled and slow-blinking, eyes full of patience. Pebble smiled first. "Mail tonight, little hedgehog," he murmured, his voice like soft gravel. Marigold nodded and knelt, pulling a pale letter wrapped in a lily pad and sealed with a petal. It smelled faintly of mint and pine, a scent Moss loved. Moss took it carefully and pressed it to her nose. She sighed. "From our grandson. He says he's learning how to float without touching the bottom." "Such progress," Pebble said proudly. Marigold smiled softly. Progress, she thought, sometimes came slowly and sometimes floated on the gentlest words. She gave a polite bow, then turned from the river's edge, the water whispering thanks behind her. The night deepened. The stars shimmered. And one letter deeper into her journey, Marigold moved on. Crescent Moon Segment 7. A letter with no name. The trail beyond the river curved softly, its edges feathered with ferns and sleepy thistles. Marigold's mailbag felt lighter now, each delivery a gentle joy placed where it belonged. She paused beneath a willow tree draped in silver threads of moss, its long arms swaying like they too were nodding off. As she reached into her bag for the next letter, her paw brushed something unfamiliar. It was a scroll she hadn't seen before. Unlike the others, this one was wrapped in thick parchment the color of ash milk, its edges worn as if touched often but opened never. A wax seal, shaped like a crescent moon, glinted under the starlight, neither broken nor marked with initials. There was no name on it, no sender, no address. Marigold turned it slowly in her paws. The parchment gave off a faint scent, lavender and something older, something like dust and memory. She sat down beneath the willow, brow furrowed. Her deliveries were always precise. This wasn't hers to deliver. And yet she had it. Was it misplaced? Forgotten? Meant for no one? But as she held it, her paws tingled slightly, and her chest felt warm. Not hot, like danger, but gentle, like the beginning of a feeling that hadn't yet found its name. The wind shifted, brushing through the grass in a hush. Marigold knew then, this letter wasn't lost. It was waiting. Crescent Moon Segment 8. The mystery begins. Marigold remained still beneath the willow, the unnamed letter resting gently in her lap. The forest around her exhaled, a soft breeze sighing through the branches, as if the trees themselves were listening. She tilted her head, studying the wax seal again. It wasn't any she recognized. No family crest, no forest marking, no leaf print or paw print. Just the moon, pressed into silver. It gleamed faintly, as if holding in light. The letter felt heavier than the others. Not in weight, but in presence. Like it carried something more than words. Perhaps a feeling too large for parchment, too quiet to say aloud. She could have left it, could have placed it on a mossy stone, and walked away. But something in her chest whispered, "This one matters." So she stood, brushing dirt from her fur, and gently tucked the letter back into her bag, deep into the side pocket she rarely used. It nestled there like it belonged. "I'll find who you're meant for," she murmured. Her voice was soft but steady. The stars above shimmered in silent agreement. Marigold looked down the path that lay ahead. It curved deeper into the woods than she usually traveled. Past the familiar, past the safe. She had already made her deliveries for the night. But this was something else. A different kind of journey. With her mailbag tight against her side, she stepped into the misty path, one paw after another, into the unknown. Crescent Moon Segment 9. The Wise Moth. Marigold walked until the path thinned to a thread of moss and moonlight, where even the trees grew quieter, their leaves barely rustling. Here, she entered a small grove shaped like a bowl in the earth, cradled by twisted roots and ferny shadows. At its center stood a stump ringed with toadstools and capped in pale lichen. Above it, hanging like a worn ribbon of dusk, hovered Orlin, the wise moth. His wings, once a brilliant gold, had faded to soft ash gray, frayed at the tips like paper lanterns caught in the rain. He barely fluttered now, but his eyes, clouded yet luminous, still carried the entire memory of the forest. Marigold bowed her head low. "I found a letter," she said. "It has no name." Orlin tilted his head, then floated down in slow, circling spirals. His legs were thin as twigs, and his voice, when it came, sounded like dry petals brushing against a window pane. "Let me feel it." She reached into her satchel and placed the letter gently on the stump. The moth's antennae brushed the wax seal. He did not speak for a long time. Finally, in a voice soft as sleep, he said, "This is a letter of longing." It was written with no address because its writer did not know who would understand it. But it's meant for someone. Marigold's brow furrowed. "Then, how will I find them?" Orlin smiled with his wings. "You won't. The letter will." Crescent Moon Segment 10. Footsteps in the fog. Marigold left the grove with the letter nestled once more in her bag, pressed against her side like a heartbeat. Orlin's words lingered in her mind. The letter will find the way. The path ahead was unfamiliar. Twigs snapped softly beneath her paws, and the air grew cooler, filled with drifting fog that kissed her nose and curled around her feet. Trees grew farther apart here, their branches stretching high like slow dancers caught mid-twirl. The forest was no longer her well-known route of regular deliveries. It was something older, deeper. She walked slowly, ears alert, senses open. Not looking for a destination, but for a feeling, a pull. The kind of nudge that comes not from direction, but from the quiet knowing that lives in the chest, just under the fur. A sound broke the stillness, gentle, like a sigh or a yawn. Marigold turned her head. There, beyond a mist-shrouded hedge, was a figure sitting on a mossy stone. Russet fur, long tail curled around lean legs, eyes half closed in thought. A fox. Young, but with a quietness about him that didn't belong to youth. He looked up when Marigold stepped closer. "You're far from the hedgerows," he said calmly, voice smooth as river water. "I could say the same to you," she replied. For a moment, they simply watched each other, fog swirling around them. Marigold's paw brushed the letter in her bag, but it remained cool. Still. Not for him. Not yet. She bowed politely and walked on, the fog thickening like unspoken words. Crescent Moon Segment 11, The Lonely Fox. Though Marigold had already turned to leave, something in the fox's eyes stayed with her, a shimmer of silence, not from peace, but from ache. She paused, then looked back. The fox had resumed his seat on the stone, tail wrapped tightly, head tilted up toward the half-hidden moon. His expression was unreadable. Not sad, not glad, just still. Marigold stepped closer and sat a respectful distance away, letting the hush between them settle like dew. The fog drifted past in soft sheets, wrapping the clearing in quiet. After a while, the fox spoke again. "Do you ever carry words that were never meant to be read?" Marigold looked at him carefully. "Sometimes," she said, "but I think they always want to be heard, even if only once." He didn't reply. A branch creaked overhead, slow and tired. Marigold's paw instinctively reached into her satchel, finding the weight of the nameless letter. She held it a moment. No warmth, no flutter, no pull. This wasn't the place. She tucked it away, stood up gently, and nodded to the fox. "Good night," she whispered. He didn't answer, but his ears twitched as she walked away. As she stepped back onto the path, the fog pressed close around her like a soft curtain. The forest here didn't feel familiar, but it didn't feel unkind. Just quiet. Just waiting. Marigold walked on with slow determination. She didn't know where she was going, but the letter did. Crescent Moon Segment 12, The Hollow Oak. The fog began to thin as Marigold climbed a small rise in the earth, her paws brushing against dew-drenched moss. Before her stood a massive oak, so wide it would take 3 badgers, paw in paw, to reach around it. Its limbs were twisted high like wooden rivers, bare of leaves, yet alive with a kind of quiet breath. The bark was furrowed deep, the color of old charcoal and moonlit soil. Marigold had passed this place once, long ago, during a spring she barely remembered. But tonight, it felt like the tree had been waiting. At its base, a hollow opened like a yawn, wide enough for her to curl inside. And after so much wandering, she suddenly felt the weight of her journey pressing into her spine, her feet, her eyelids. She stepped into the hollow. The inside smelled of old wood, dry leaves, and rain long gone. The walls were smooth where animals had slept, carved by time, and the softness of bodies seeking shelter. Marigold settled on a bed of old moss, her bag at her side, the mysterious letter resting gently against her ribs. Outside, the wind rustled gently through the branches. The forest did not sleep. It watched. It breathed. And Marigold, wrapped in quiet, closed her eyes. In that dark and sacred stillness, the letter pulsed faintly with warmth. Not from her, from somewhere else. As if, in dreams, it had finally begun to speak. Crescent Moon Segment 13, Dream of the Unspoken. That night, within the shelter of the hollow oak, Marigold dreamed. But not the kind of dream made of floating shapes and wandering thoughts. This one came gently, like a memory that had waited for permission to be seen. She found herself standing in a meadow of pale grass that swayed without wind. Above her, the stars blinked slowly, closer than they should have been. And in front of her, on a stone just like the one by the river, sat the letter. Unopened, glowing faintly. The wax seal shimmered, and for the first time, it cracked. But there were no words inside. Instead, the air filled with a sound. Not a voice, but a hum. Like the feeling of someone brushing your hand without touching it. A lullaby with no melody, only meaning. She felt warmth rise in her chest, and her throat ached, not from pain, but from recognition. There was sorrow here, yes, but more than that, longing. Love that had no name. Regret wrapped in tenderness. A goodbye that was never spoken. Tears welled gently in her sleeping eyes. The letter was not meant to be read. It was meant to be felt. And in the dream, Marigold understood. This letter was not simply a message. It was a bridge between a heart that had written something it could not say and one that had been waiting to feel it. When she awoke, morning had not come, but the letter pulsed softly in her bag. Ready. Crescent Moon Segment 14, The Old Badger. Marigold rose before the dawn stirred the treetops. A quiet strength filled her paws, not from rest, but from understanding. She knew now the letter was unlike any she had carried before. It was not for delivering in the usual way. It needed something more. She followed a winding trail through the thinning mist, up a slope lined with mushrooms shaped like little bells. At the top stood a den carved into the side of a hill, framed by gnarled roots and moss. This was the home of Elder Mossback. The badger was older than the oldest path. His fur was mottled with white and gray, his back hunched, his eyes clouded like morning fog. But he saw with something deeper than sight. He sat outside his den, wrapped in a cloak made of stitched bark and faded memories. I wondered when you'd arrive, he said, his voice like earth and oak. Marigold bowed politely, then placed the letter on the stone between them. It has no name, she said, but I think it's calling. The badger leaned forward, his heavy paws brushing the edge of the parchment. He closed his eyes and breathed in the lavender scent. This letter, he murmured, was written long ago, not with words, but with feeling. It was sealed when the heart could not speak. And now it waits, not for a name, but for a moment. Marigold blinked. A moment, she asked. Elder Mossback smiled, slow and knowing. The moment someone is ready to hear it. Crescent Moon Segment 15. A Return to the Meadow. Marigold left the hilltop as the last threads of night still clung to the treetops. The stars had begun their slow fade, and a soft violet hue crept into the sky's edge. She retraced her steps, not to familiar places, but to familiar feelings. The path no longer needed to be clear. Her paws knew. The letter, nestled in her bag, pulsed with a quiet warmth now, not constant, but steady, like the rhythm of a thought held close. She followed the breeze, the pull behind her ribs, and the hush in the grass. It led her past Glowberry Grove, past the sleepy river, and down a slope she hadn't noticed before. There, at the forest's edge, lay a wide, open meadow wrapped in low mist. The grass shimmered with dew, and a few sleepy fireflies blinked their final light before day. In the center of the meadow, sitting very still, was a hare. Marigold stopped. The hare was pale-furred, soft cream, almost silver in the low light, and sat with her long ears folded gently back. Her eyes stared upward, not at anything in particular, but at the place where the stars had been. She didn't move when Marigold stepped closer, but she didn't flinch either. There was something in her stillness that felt familiar, like waiting, like listening. Marigold's heart gave a small thud. She knew. The letter was glowing faintly in her bag. At last, it had found the place it had been written for. Crescent Moon Segment 16. The hare with the sad eyes. Marigold approached slowly, each step soft against the damp meadow earth. She didn't want to startle the hare, though something told her the hare had been expecting her in a way that neither of them could quite explain. The hare didn't look at her right away. Her eyes, large and glassy, remained on the horizon, where the last stars were dissolving into morning's first breath. But as Marigold sat beside her, just close enough to feel her quiet presence, the hare finally turned her gaze. Her eyes shimmered with a sorrow that was not heavy, but deep. The kind of sadness that had been carried a long time. Not crying, not sharp, just there, settled gently into the corners of her face. Marigold gave a small nod of greeting. "I think," she said softly, "I have something for you." The hare blinked slowly. Her ears shifted slightly, not up, not down, just listening. Marigold opened her satchel and pulled out the letter. The seal no longer gleamed. It glowed, faint and warm, as though it had been touched by dawn. She held it out. The hare looked at it, not with surprise, but with stillness. Her paw trembled slightly as she reached for it, and as it settled in her grasp, something shifted in the air. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Instead, she pressed it gently to her chest, closed her eyes, and breathed. A long, slow breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. And she whispered, almost to herself, "Yes, I'd been waiting. I just didn't know." Crescent Moon Segment 17. The right recipient. Marigold said nothing more. She simply sat beside the hare as the sky above softened into morning, streaked with lavender and the faintest blush of gold. The mist around the meadow began to lift, curling and vanishing like breath on a mirror. The hare still held the letter close, her paws cradling it not like an object, but like a memory finally returned. Her expression had changed, still quiet, still tender, but now threaded with something new. Relief. Marigold watched as the hare's eyes closed again, not in weariness, but in peace. The letter, though unopened, seemed to glow brighter now, not with urgency, but with knowing. As if the message had already arrived, not through words, but through presence. "It says everything I couldn't say to her," the hare murmured after a while, eyes still closed. "And everything I needed to hear." She didn't explain further, and Marigold didn't ask. She didn't need to. The meaning was in the moment, in the hush between them, in the soft light that painted their fur. After a time, the hare opened her eyes and looked at Marigold, not searching, not questioning, but simply seeing her. "Thank you," she said, her voice no longer trembling. "You carried more than a letter." Marigold gave a small smile. She gently nodded, stood, and tucked her satchel across her shoulder again. The wind stirred the grass around them, a soft chorus of farewells. One letter lighter, but something in her chest heavier with meaning, Marigold turned toward the trees once more. Crescent Moon Segment 18, a quiet unfolding. As Marigold stepped away from the meadow, she paused once, just at the edge of the trees. She turned back, not out of doubt, but reverence. The hare still sat in the center of the field, her cream-colored fur bathed in the blush of morning light. And though her eyes were closed, her expression was brighter, softened in a way only healing can do. The letter, once sealed in silence, now rested open in her lap. It had unfolded on its own, as if it had simply been waiting for permission, not to speak, but to be understood. Above the parchment, a golden glow hovered like morning fog warmed by sunlight. No words lay on the page. And yet, in that glowing space, something deeper than writing was felt. A warmth spread across the field like the hush of lullabies and the comfort of remembered voices. The grass shimmered. The air pulsed. Even the birds, just waking in the treetops, fell quiet for a breath. Marigold stood still, her paws pressed into the cool soil, and let the moment wash over her. It wasn't her letter. It wasn't her story. But she had helped it find its way. And now, the story was resting exactly where it belonged. The forest didn't cheer. The sky didn't shout. But something subtle, something sacred had happened. And the world, ever so softly, had changed. Crescent Moon Segment 19, The Journey Home. Marigold turned back toward the woods, her satchel swinging lightly at her side, its usual weight now gone. But in its place, inside her chest, was a new fullness. Not heavy, but warm, like candlelight behind the ribs. The path home wound gently beneath her feet. She passed through the forest as the light shifted, no longer moonlight, but the silvery blue of early dawn. The leaves above held the hush of morning prayers, and every branch seemed to lean just slightly as she walked beneath them, like nods of quiet approval. She retraced her steps through Glowberry Grove, where the lantern berries now dimmed, curling into themselves like yawns. The moths had tucked away into bark shadows. She crossed the river, where the surface gleamed like brushed silver, and the turtles, still half asleep, raised their heads just enough to nod as she passed. At the base of the old oak where the wrens nested, Marigold paused. Renling peeked out with a feather still stuck to his cheek. "Was it a good route?" he asked through a yawn. Marigold smiled, her voice softer than moss. "Yes," she said. "A different kind of delivery." She didn't explain. She didn't need to. The wrens chirped once more and tucked their heads back into sleep. And as the first light of morning spilled through the trees, Marigold stepped into the cool shadows of her hollow, heart gently glowing with everything she had carried and everything she had let go. Segment 20. The final note. Inside her cozy hollow beneath the birch roots, the world was still and hushed. Pale morning light filtered through the cracks in the bark above, dappling her floor with soft gold. The air smelled of dried lavender and pine, and her tiny mailbag, now empty, hung neatly on its wooden peg. Marigold sat at her desk, carved from an old toadstool stump, and pulled out a fresh piece of parchment made from pressed leaves. She dipped her paw into a jar of berry ink, hesitated for only a moment, then began to write. Her paw moved slowly, but without doubt. For those who never heard the words they needed, may the moon carry them gently. May silence be softened by kindness. And may someone somewhere send them. She let the ink dry in the early light, then folded the letter with care and tied it with a thread of spider silk. No name, no address, just a message. She placed it gently in her satchel, not because she knew who it was for, but because one day she would. The forest was stirring now, the birds beginning to sing, light warming the mist. Somewhere out there, another heart would be waiting, quietly, patiently, and Marigold, the quietest hedgehog in the woods, would be ready. She curled up in her nest of moss and soft roots, eyes growing heavy, heart completely still. And as she drifted to sleep, the letter glowed faintly in her bag, waiting for its next journey to begin.